Usually when we stand at the base of like a magnificent skyscraper, we just sort of tilt our heads back and marvel at it, you know?
Right, the glass, the steel, all of it.
Yeah, exactly. We admire the architecture reaching up into the clouds. We just assume the structural engineers did their jobs.
Which is a fair assumption, honestly.
For sure. We assume that underneath it all, hidden from view, the foundation is poured concrete, anchored directly into solid bedrock. We trust the invisible groundwork.
Right, because, I mean, it makes complete sense to trust it. You don't build something that massive, something that houses so much weight in history without a flawless, unshakable foundation. The assumption of stability is basically what allows the building to exist in the first place.
I mean, imagine walking into the basement of that exact same skyscraper. You shine a flashlight into a dark corner, and you spot a massive, jagged crack in the concrete.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's not what you want to see.
No, definitely not. So you start digging into the dirt beneath the footing, pulling away the layers, and suddenly that comforting assumption of solid bedrock just shatters. You realize you are looking at an architectural landscape built entirely on shifting sand.
Held together by, like, temporary patches.
Exactly, patches that were never actually meant to bear the weight of the structure above.
Which, completely transforms the entire building from a marvel of engineering into a structural disaster waiting to happen. Just hiding in plain sight right under everyone's feet.
Right. So today we are grabbing our hard hats, turning on those flashlights, and bringing a forensic toolkit into the basement of one of the most massive theological skyscrapers in Western history.
I am so ready for this.
Our mission for this deep dive is to unpack a genuinely paradigm-shifting thesis. We're doing a complete chapter-by-chapter analysis of a landmark doctoral thesis turned book by Dr. Ken Wilson. It's titled The Foundation of Augustinian Calvinism.
And this is a heavy topic, right? Because for 500 years, Protestant Reformed theology, which is, often broadly categorized as Calvinism, has been built on the towering intellect of a single man.
Right, Augustine of Hippo.
Exactly. He is the foundational pillar. But this deep dive asks a terrifying question, really. What if Augustine's theological skyscraper was actually built on a foundation of pagan sand?
Yeah. What if a 1,500-year-old theological pivot essentially poisoned the well of Western Christianity?
The sheer scale of what this thesis questions, it cannot be overstated. We are examining the core doctrines that fundamentally shaped the Protestant Reformation.
Doctrines that literally continue to dictate how millions of people around the world understand God today.
Right, how they understand the character of God, the nature of human agency, and, the mechanics of salvation itself.
So to get to the bottom of this, we need to explore how Augustine, who is arguably the most famous and venerated theologian in Western history, how he secretly imported highly deterministic pagan philosophies into the Christian faith.
And how he inadvertently created the famous two-ulip theology we know today.
Yeah, and how in doing so, he single-handedly overturned 300 years of unanimous, settled early Christian teaching.
Which is just a wild thing to wrap your head around.
It really is. So, if you are listening to this right now, I want you to think of our conversation today as a theological true crime investigation.
I love that analogy.
Thanks. We're going to look at forensic textual evidence, ancient mistranslations, geopolitical rivalries, and severe personal trauma, just to figure out how a massive ideological heist took place right under history's nose.
And, well, to understand a heist, you have to start by examining the scene of the crime before the vault was broken into, right?
Exactly. We have to analyze the philosophical water that Augustine was swimming in before he ever converted to Christianity.
Right. And those intellectual waters of antiquity were heavily polluted with this concept of absolute determinism. The Greco-Roman world didn't operate in a vacuum.
Not at all.
It was dominated by four major philosophical and religious systems. You had Stoicism, Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, and Manichaeism.
Right, and Dr. Wilson's thesis groups their core unifying belief regarding human destiny under a really helpful acronym. It's DUPIED.
Yeah, divine unilateral predetermination of individuals' eternal destinies.
Let's break that acronym down mechanically, just because it sounds so dense.
Sure.
Divine unilateral predetermination. This means the gods, or the cosmic fates, basically make decisions entirely on their own. They completely pre-program where every single human soul ends up.
Without any input whatsoever.
Exactly. Without any input, cooperation, or consent from the humans themselves.
That captures the essence perfectly, yeah. So let's look at the first pillar of this, which is Stoicism.
Okay, the Stoics.
Right. The Stoics taught a doctrine of strict causal determinism, which they affectionately called providence.
Oh, that's a loaded word.
Very. In the Stoic worldview, every minuscule event is meticulously micromanaged and fated by the divine, like a leaf falling from a tree.
Or a dog barking in the distance.
Exactly. Or even the specific thoughts firing in your brain right now. All of it is prescripted.
Wow.
Yeah. The famous Stoic philosopher Seneca the Younger summed up this fatalistic worldview in a widely quoted maxim. He said, "The fates lead the willing and drag the unwilling."
So basically, your destination is absolutely fixed.
100%. You can either go along with your fate with a smile on your face, or you can get dragged kicking and screaming through the dirt. But, you are arriving at the exact same predetermined coordinates regardless of your attitude.
Okay, but wait. If everything is strictly fated, why did Stoics spend so much time writing ethical treatises? I mean, they were obsessed with virtue and making good choices.
That's a great paradox.
Right. The ancient sources indicate these pagan groups actually claimed humans possess free will, while in the exact same breath declaring every single human action was fated by the gods.
Yeah.
That just sounds like a blatant contradiction. How did they pull off that philosophical gymnastics routine without getting laughed out of the public square?
Well, they executed it through a brilliant piece of psychological manipulation and, honestly, semantic redefinition. Scholars refer to this maneuver as pseudo-compatibilism.
Pseudo-compatibilism.
Yeah. So an early Stoic philosopher named Chrysippus, he recognized a massive vulnerability in their system. He realized that if people truly internalized that everything was strictly fated, society would just collapse into moral apathy.
Oh, for sure. Like, why try to be a good person if your actions are predetermined anyway?
Exactly. No one would try to be virtuous. So Chrysippus redefined the very definition of free will. He separated the concept of causal determinism from the concept of necessity, using this incredibly nuanced, almost deceitful trick.
What did he do?
He argued that even if a person has zero actual possibility of making a different choice in reality, as long as the theoretical opportunity for choice technically exists in a vacuum, that person has free will.
That sounds like a completely rigged game. You have a choice in theory, but not in practice.
It totally is. The Stoics illustrated this with the famous analogy of a dog tied to a moving cart.
Okay, I've heard of this one.
Yeah. The dog can choose to trot happily alongside the cart, or the dog can choose to sit down and protest and be brutally dragged by the neck.
Right.
The cart, which represents divine providence, is moving along a predetermined path no matter what the dog does. So the Stoics redefined free will to simply mean acting according to your own desires.
Okay, so if the dog desires to run, it is acting freely.
Exactly.
Ah.
But the dark secret, the trapdoor hidden beneath Stoic ethics, is that the gods completely pre-program your desires.
Oh.
Yeah. They implant what Wilson's analysis calls an evil willer in certain people. Your character is fated, your internal desires are fated, and therefore your choices are fated.
So you are essentially a biological robot programmed to desperately want the very thing you are forced by the universe to do.
Yet the gods still hold you morally responsible for doing it.
That's insane.
It is the illusion of agency. It's a non-free free will.
Okay, so you have free will solely because you are doing what you want, but the gods literally wrote the software code that makes you want it. You can't choose to want something else. Wow. Okay, so that covers Stoicism, which feels very cold and, mechanical. Let's move to the second major system in this Greco-Roman landscape, Neoplatonism.
Right.
If Stoicism was highly materialistic, how did the more spiritually minded philosophers tackle human agency?
Neoplatonism, which was primarily popularized by the philosopher Plotinus, took a much more mystical approach to determinism.
Okay.
Plotinus taught that humanity totally lost the imago Dei, the divine image or spark of God, when human souls fell from the spiritual realm into physical material bodies.
So the body is the problem.
Yes, in this worldview, physical matter is a dense, corrupting trap. Because we are inextricably bound to physical matter, our human will is entirely dead to anything spiritual.
Got it.
We possess an inherently evil will. Therefore, a human being is fundamentally incapable of choosing to do good on their own initiative.
So what's the solution? How does anyone do good?
Well, they require a unilateral, overwhelming divine infusion of love from the ultimate divine source, which they called the One, just to have the capacity to choose the good.
Wait, so the One has to forcefully inject you with the desire for goodness before you can even conceptualize wanting it?
That is exactly right. And Plotinus took it even further. He taught that the One micromanages the entire universe, predestines every single event, and actually intentionally creates significantly more evil people than good people
Why on earth would it do that?
to maintain a sort of cosmic aesthetic balance.
Wow.
Yeah. Yet, magically, the one is completely exonerated from any moral culpability for the evil it causes and predestines.
How does that work? If the one made them evil, how is it their fault?
It's totally illogical. But in their system, the human beings are tortured in the afterlife in Tartarus for doing exactly what the one programmed them to do. And the universe is considered perfectly just simply because the one dictates the definition of justice.
Man. So the system is just completely rigged to protect the absolute sovereignty of the deity at the total expense of the creature.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have Stoic biological robots and Neoplatonic dead wills requiring divine injections. This brings us to the third and fourth systems,
Yeah.
Gnosticism and Manichaeism.
Right. And this is where the investigation gets highly personal.
Right, because the biographical sources confirm that Augustine was a devoted Manichaean for a full decade before he ever converted to Christianity.
Yes.
He wasn't just aware of this philosophy, he lived and breathed it.
His 10-year immersion in Manichaeism is a crucial piece of forensic evidence for Wilson's thesis, because Gnosticism and its later, more radical offspring, Manichaeism, taught an extreme form of cosmic dualism,
Meaning what, exactly?
meaning everything physical, especially the human body, is inherently and irredeemably evil. Physical matter isn't just a trap. It is a cosmic mistake or a curse created by an evil lesser deity.
Right.
A prominent Gnostic teacher named Valentinus taught a very specific, deterministic type of salvation. He preached that the highest God offers the general message of salvation to everyone, but, and here's that deupide ad limit rearing its head again.
Only the predetermined elect.
Exactly. Only the predetermined elect are unilaterally empowered by God to actually accept it. God implants a hidden spiritual seed only in the elect prior to their birth.
So what about everyone else?
Everyone else is just biological chaff, doomed by their physical nature to eternal destruction, completely incapable of responding to the call.
That is so bleak. And Mani, the Persian founder of Manichaeism, escalated this Gnostic framework into an even more oppressive system, right?
He really did. Mani built a wildly successful syncretistic religion, just mashing together elements of Judaism, Buddhism, early Christianity, and Zoroastrianism.
A real ancient theological melting pot.
Exactly. And he taught that the original fall of humanity wasn't about eating a piece of fruit. It was fundamentally about sexual lust among the dark, demonic rulers of the physical world.
Oh, wow.
For the Manichaeans, the act of sex itself transmitted the disease of sin. Even the mere desire for sex was a profound evil.
So because every human being is born through a physical sexual act,
Every baby is entirely damned at the very moment of birth. Yeah. The human soul is utterly dead, trapped in a drunken, oblivious slumber inside the prison of evil matter. A dead soul cannot ask for a doctor. It cannot reach out for a life preserver.
right, it's completely unconscious.
Exactly. It has to be awakened entirely unilaterally, without its prior consent, by a massive, overpowering infusion of divine grace.
So stepping back to look at the entire Greco-Roman world, the philosophical atmosphere is just suffocating.
It really is.
It is absolutely saturated in this oppressive, fatalistic determinism. I mean, the Stoics, the Neoplatonists, the Gnostics, the Manichaeans, despite all their other cosmic disagreements, they all fundamentally agree that your eternal destiny is completely out of your hands.
Yeah, that's the common denominator.
The gods pre-program your desires, your physical body is a corrupt prison, your will is dead on arrival, and you are just an actor playing out a cosmic script you didn't write.
A script you had no say in.
Right. So if that was the dominant philosophical air everyone was breathing in the first few centuries of the Common Era, how did the very first generations of Christians react to it? Did they just absorb it to make their new religion more palatable to the culture?
Actually, the historical record shows they did the exact opposite. They went to absolute intellectual war against it.
Wow.
They recognized DUPI as the sheer antithesis of the gospel they had received.
Which transitions us perfectly to the second phase of Wilson's investigation, the unanimous early church.
Right.
Because Wilson's doctoral research exhaustively catalogs over 50 early Christian authors writing from the year 95 CE all the way to 400 CE.
Which is a massive sample size.
It is. We are talking about the immediate generations following the original apostles, people who were handed the baton directly. And the data he presents here is just staggering in its uniformity. humanity.
The visual representation in Wilson's book is actually really striking. He provides this timeline chart mapping the theological landscape.
Oh, I love a good chart. What does it show?
So on the top half, you see this massive, unbroken, monolithic block of pagan determinism. The Stoics, the Platonists, the Manichaeans.
Okay.
But running perfectly parallel to it on the bottom half, from the year 95 to 400, you have a completely unanimous block of Christian authors defending human free choice.
All of them.
All of them. Out of all the Christian theologians, bishops, and apologists studied in that expansive 300-year window, not a single one taught DUPI.
That's crazy.
Not one taught unilateral determinism or total human inability.
Let's contextualize how rare that kind of agreement is, Think
Yeah.
about the United States Supreme Court. Getting 9 highly educated justices with similar backgrounds to agree on a complex constitutional issue today is like a minor miracle.
Oh, sure. We constantly see 5-4 or 6-3 splits.
Exactly. Now imagine a Supreme Court that sits continuously for 300 years, presiding over hundreds of different theological cases, spanning dozens of radically different cultures, from the deserts of North Africa to the cities of the Middle East to the forests of Europe.
It's unprecedented.
And for 3 solid centuries, the ruling on human agency is always exactly the same, 9-0. That represents the early Christian consensus on free will. They were completely unbreakably united around the fundamental premise that God invites, and humans retain the capacity to choose.
And the sheer volume of their writings defending this is overwhelming. I mean, consider figures
Plato.
like Justin Martyr, writing in the 2nd century.
He was a philosopher who converted to Christianity, right?
And he aggressively attacked Stoic fate. Justin argued brilliantly that if human beings aren't genuinely responsible for their ethical choices, like if they're just acting out pre-programmed scripts, the entire moral structure of the universe collapses into absurdity.
Because rewards for virtue and punishments for vice basically become cosmic tyranny at that point.
Exactly. Or look at Irenaeus of Lyons, writing just a few decades later. He specifically dedicated his life to battling the deterministic Gnostics.
What was his main argument against them?
Irenaeus argued fiercely that humans retained the imago Dei, the image of God, even after Adam's fall in Eden. For Irenaeus, the image of God wasn't a physical resemblance, it was the capacity for rational freedom of choice.
So to lose free will was to lose humanity itself.
Precisely.
Okay, but I can hear an objection forming from anyone familiar with the New Testament. I mean, the Apostle Paul explicitly talks about predestination in the book of Romans and Ephesians.
He does, yeah.
Did these early Christians just, ignore those verses or cut them out of their Bibles? How did they handle the very real scriptural language of predestination?
Oh, they engaged with those texts deeply, but they defined the terms radically differently than Augustine later would. The early church absolutely taught a doctrine of predestination.
Oh, they did?
Yes, but they defined it as strictly relational and conditional. God's predestination of individuals to salvation was based entirely on his divine foreknowledge of their future, uncoerced human choices.
Okay, we need to unpack the mechanics of foreknowledge, because conflating foreknowledge with determinism is a very, very easy trap to fall into.
It is, and the early church fathers were meticulous about this distinction. Think of it like a seasoned teacher who has observed a class of students all year long.
Okay.
The teacher knows their personalities, their work ethics, their struggles. The teacher can perfectly foreknow, with absolute certainty, who will study hard and pass the final exam and who will slack off, play video games, and fail.
Makes sense.
The teacher foreknows the outcome, but the teacher's knowledge doesn't force or cause the student to fail. The student remains the active agent of their own demise.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah. Origen of Alexandria, who was one of the most brilliant early Christian minds,
Mm-hmm.
he spent immense energy distinguishing Christian foreknowledge from pagan fate.
How did he explain it?
He explained that God, existing outside of time, foreknows what you will freely choose to do. Based on that perfect foreknowledge of your free choice, God predestines your ultimate outcome, salvation or judgment. But God's foreknowledge does not cause your choice. The arrow of causality points from your choice to God's knowledge, not the other way around.
Got it. So the early Christians weren't just naive optimists. They fully acknowledged humanity was fallen.
Absolutely. They knew the world was deeply broken by sin.
Right. They universally believed physical mortality and an environment of suffering were inherited from Adam. But they drew a hard, uncompromising line. Humans are not worthless worms with totally dead wills.
Right.
They retained what Wilson calls residual free choice.
Yeah. Tertullian, another foundational North African church father, argued that while human nature was darkened and burdened by the fall, every single person retains the innate capacity to believe and respond to God.
Just because of that lingering, ineradicable nature given by the Creator.
Exactly. And they fought tooth and nail for this doctrine because, in their minds, the very character of God was on trial here.
Which makes total sense. If God unilaterally programs who goes to heaven and who goes to hell without taking any human response into account, like the tyrannical deity of the Manichaeans, then God ceases to be a just, loving judge.
Right.
He literally becomes a cruel puppet master, quartering the puppets he built specifically to fail.
And the early fathers pointed out the logical nightmare of that determinism. Like, if God forces a select group of people to believe while actively blocking the rest of humanity from believing, then all of the heartfelt invitations, warnings, and pleas found throughout Scripture are completely meaningless.
They just become deceptive theater.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Genuine relational love fundamentally requires the possibility of rejection. A programmed robot cannot love you, it can only execute a command.
Right.
So for 300 years, the universally accepted Christian rule of faith, their foundational regula fide, was clear. God offers the medicine of salvation equally to all sick people, and humans, despite the severity of their illness, possess the residual free will to open their mouths and accept the unmerited cure, or to bat the cup away.
Wow. Okay, so this brings us to a massive historical collision. If the entire Christian world, spanning multiple continents from 95 CE to 400 CE, was perfectly, unanimously united on human free will, what happens when Augustine enters the narrative?
All right.
I mean, he converts to Christianity in 386 CE after escaping the Manichaean cult. Does he immediately march into the church and start tearing down this 300-year consensus?
Not at all. The historical forensics here are incredibly revealing, and they actually contradict the popular narrative.
Really?
Yeah. For the first half of his career as a Christian thinker and eventually a bishop, Augustine was in complete lockstep agreement with the traditional early church.
Wait, what?
From his conversion in 386 CE all the way until 411 CE, he was one of the most eloquent and staunch defenders of traditional free choice in the Roman Empire.
Hold on. The man universally famous for inventing the doctrines of total human depravity and unilateral predestination actually spent the first 25 years of his Christian ministry fighting vigorously against those exact concepts.
He did. He actually used traditional free choice theology as his primary weapon to publicly debate and intellectually dismantle the Manichaeans, the very cult he had belonged to.
That's wild.
We have transcripts of these debates. He mercilessly mocked the concept of their deterministic God. He wrote explicitly that if human beings sin by sheer necessity because their nature forces them to, then holding them morally accountable and punishing them is a gross miscarriage of justice.
Because it's not their fault.
Exactly. He taught, without hesitation, that God's election of believers is based entirely on his foreknowledge of who will freely choose to believe.
Okay, so something catastrophic must have changed. I mean, the modern scholarly consensus, the narrative you find in most standard church history textbooks, claims that Augustine shifted his views relatively early in his Christian life, like around the year 396 CE.
That's the story, yeah.
The story goes that he was deeply studying the Apostle Paul's letters to the Romans and Galatians, specifically while writing a text called Ad Simplicianum, and he had this theological epiphany. He supposedly read the Bible with fresh eyes, realized the entire church had been wrong for 3 centuries, and embraced determinism purely based on Scripture. Is that true?
Well, Wilson's forensic textual analysis absolutely obliterates that standard timeline.
Oh, wow.
It subjects that traditional narrative to rigorous data analysis and finds it entirely lacking. I mean, if Augustine genuinely changed his mind to strict unilateral determinism in 396 CE after reading Paul, basic logic dictates that we should see that new deterministic theology consistently reflected in everything he wrote after that date.
Yeah, because if you discover a massive foundational truth about how the universe operates, you don't just keep it a secret for 15 years.
Exactly, and the data is undeniable. Between the years 396 and 411 CE, Augustine authored 27 major works alongside thousands of preserved letters and sermons.
And Wilson analyzed all of them.
Dr. Wilson analyzed this entire corpus. And in all of that massive volume of material, you cannot find his famous deterministic 2OP theology.
Really? None of it?
None. He consistently continues to teach universal calling. He teaches that fallen humans possess the capacity to respond to God's grace. He forcefully teaches that God genuinely desires all people to be saved. The determinism simply isn't there.
Wait, okay, so what about the specific texts where modern scholars say he changed his mind? The documents from 395 and 396. Like, if the determinism isn't in his later works, how did it get into those specific early texts?
And you have just highlighted the smoking gun of Wilson's investigation.
Oh, boy.
Wilson draws attention to two bizarre, glaring anomalies in Augustine's earlier texts, De Libero Arbitrio, which translates to on free will, and the aforementioned Ad Simplicianum. Let's perform a little autopsy on De Libero Arbitrio.
Let's do it.
Augustine wrote the vast majority of this text to defend human free will against Manichaean fatalism. It flows logically. But suddenly, right in the middle of Book 3, spanning paragraphs 47 through 54, the entire architecture of the text violently shifts.
In what way?
A minor dialogue character named Devotius, who hadn't spoken a single word in the previous 40 chapters, inexplicably appears for one single paragraph to ask a highly leading deterministic question and then vanishes forever.
A character just pops into existence to tee up a theological pivot and then evaporates?
Yeah.
That is incredibly suspicious.
It gets worse. The anomalies compound. In those specific paragraphs, Augustine's tone morphs from a calm, philosophical, conversational style into a pompous, aggressive, moralizing lecture.
Okay.
Furthermore, there's an unprecedented cluster of biblical proof texts deployed in these paragraphs that perfectly match the exact arguments he makes at the very end of his life.
Interesting.
There's a sudden, jarring outburst of first-person plural pronouns. He starts using the word we repeatedly, which is a stylistic quirk not found anywhere else in the surrounding book.
Wow, so the voice completely changes.
Totally. And crucially, for the first time in his entire life, he uses the word sin not to describe a personal, willful, immoral choice, but to describe an inherited biological penalty passed down from Adam.
Just in those few paragraphs.
Just there. Then, magically, at paragraph 55, the text just snaps back to normal.
You're kidding.
Nope. He returns to his traditional defense of free will, completely ignoring the massive deterministic bomb he just dropped, as if paragraphs 47 through 54 never existed.
Okay, I need to stop you here because this is a monumental claim. If Augustine didn't write those highly deterministic sections in 396 when he authored the rest of the book, how on earth did they get in there?
Wow.
Are we accusing a venerated saint of forgery? Did like a rogue medieval monk with a theological agenda hack his scrolls centuries later?
We aren't accusing a medieval monk. The forensic evidence points directly to an inside job by Augustine himself.
Augustine hacked his own scrolls.
Basically, yeah. To understand how this is possible, you have to understand the mechanics of ancient manuscript publication and preservation. Augustine was the Bishop of Hippo. He meticulously maintained the master copies of all his major works in his personal, secure library in North Africa.
Okay, so he had the originals.
Yeah. Exactly. Fast forward over 15 years later, after a massive geopolitical and theological crisis forced him to radically change his theology to determinism, he found himself in a really precarious position.
What happened?
His opponents started quoting his own earlier books against him, proving he used to believe in free will.
Oh, that's awkward.
Very. Realizing his older writings were a liability, Augustine walked into his library, unrolled the master scrolls of De Libero Arbitrio and Ad Simplicianum, and retroactively edited those time-bomb paragraphs directly into the middle of his old texts.
He retconned his own theological history.
Yes.
That is just... wow, it's like a movie studio going back and digitally altering a character's backstory in the first movie just to make a messy plot twist in the sequel seem planned from the beginning.
That is the perfect way to describe it. It is an ancient theological retcon. He inserted his newly developed deterministic theology into his old books to create a paper trail.
So it would look like his new ideas had historical precedent in his own spiritual journey.
Exactly. He wanted to prove he had organically discovered this in Scripture years earlier. But because he only patched a few isolated paragraphs and left the surrounding free will defending text entirely intact, those patched sections stick out to modern forensic scholars like a neon sign.
That is mind-blowing.
And when you surgically remove those later insertions, Augustine's theology remains perfectly traditional, orthodox, and centered on free will all the way up until the year 412 CE.
Okay, so this changes the entire timeline of Western theology. If he didn't change his mind in 396 CE while quietly reading the Apostle Paul in his study, what actually broke him?
Right.
What monumental event happened 15 years later that exerted enough pressure to force one of the greatest minds of the ancient world to completely abandon the 300-year consensus of the Christian church and retreat into the oppressive pagan determinism he used to fight?
To find the breaking point, we actually have to look away from the Bible. Yeah. We have to look at geopolitics, a fierce theological rival, and the intense pressure to defend a very specific, localized church tradition. We have to travel to the catastrophic year of 410 CE.
410 CE, the fall of Rome.
Exactly. The psychological impact of 410 CE cannot be overstated. The Visigoths, led by Alaric, sacked the eternal city of Rome.
Which was unthinkable at the time.
For the Roman citizens, it felt like the literal end of the world. It sent unimaginable shockwaves of terror through the entire empire. As the city burns, massive numbers of wealthy and educated refugees flee across the Mediterranean Sea, seeking safety in North Africa.
Landing right in Augustine's backyard.
Right in his backyard. And among these traumatized refugees is a group of ascetic, highly disciplined Christians led by a charismatic British monk named Pelagius.
Oh, the infamous Pelagians. Anyone who has taken a basic church history class has heard of the Pelagian controversy. They are always cast as the ultimate heretics.
Yeah.
What were they teaching that caused such an immediate panic in North Africa?
Well, the Pelagians looked around at the moral decay of the collapsing Roman world, and they believed the only solution was for Christians to live with strict, uncompromising, rigorous morality.
Okay.
To emphasize absolute human responsibility, they went to an extreme theological length. They taught that Adam's original fall in the Garden of Eden was merely a bad historical example.
A bad example.
Yeah, it was just a poor choice that set a bad precedent. It was emphatically not a spiritual disease, and it was certainly not an inherited condition that corrupted the fundamental human nature of subsequent generations.
Wow.
They boldly claimed that every single baby is born into the world in the exact same pristine, uncorrupted state that Adam possessed before the fall.
So they completely erased the concept of original sin.
They eradicated it. The traditional early church believed humans inherited physical mortality, suffering, and a weakened propensity towards sin from Adam. But the Pelagians denied even that weakness. They argued human nature was completely intact.
But wait, how did that sit with Augustine?
It caused a massive, immediate collision with a deeply entrenched, localized tradition in Augustine's North African church, the practice of infant baptism. The Pelagians looked at the North African bishops and asked a devastatingly logical question. If, as we claim, babies are born completely innocent with absolutely no personal sin and no inherited corruption whatsoever, why does your church desperately rush to baptize them?
That is a phenomenal question. I mean, if the sacrament of baptism is explicitly designed to wash away sin, and the baby hasn't committed any sin, what exactly are you washing away?
Exactly. The Pelagians caught Augustine entirely off guard. Infant baptism wasn't a universal doctrine handed down by the apostles. It was a regional tradition that had developed over time, and it was deeply woven into the cultural fabric of his local church.
So he had to defend it.
Augustine felt intense pressure to defend his church's practice against these foreign elite refugees.
Yeah.
To justify the ritual, Augustine realized he had to invent a robust theological reason for why a newborn baby desperately needed saving.
So what did he do?
He began a chain of logical deduction that would inadvertently change the course of human history.
Walk us through the mechanics of his deduction. How did he get from a baptismal font to predestination?
It happens in 3 fatal steps.
Okay, step 1.
Step 1. Augustine acknowledges that babies obviously have committed no personal sin. They haven't done anything wrong.
Makes sense.
Step 2. But his local church tradition dictates that they absolutely must be baptized to receive the Holy Spirit and be saved from hell.
Okay, so there's a tension.
Right, so step 3. Therefore, if they have no personal sin but need saving, they must carry a hidden, inherited, damnable guilt directly from Adam.
Damnable guilt.
Yes. Augustine called this concept riatus. He radically concluded that every human being isn't merely born into a broken, mortal world. They are born legally, forensically guilty of Adam's ancient crime.
Oh.
Therefore, every infant is violently damned to the fires of hell the exact second they're born.
The theological leap there is just staggering. I mean, the early church said we inherit physical death and a weakness from Adam. Augustine takes it a massive, terrifying step further. He says we inherit the actual legal guilt and the eternal punishment of a crime committed millennia before we even existed.
And this specific invention creates what Dr. Wilson refers to as the logical trap.
The logical trap. Unpack that.
Because if every baby is born legally damned, and they absolutely require the ritual of baptism to be saved, how does the baby get baptized? A newborn baby has no free will.
Right.
A newborn cannot walk to the church.
Mm.
A newborn cannot cognitively believe the gospel or profess faith.
Yeah.
Therefore, the salvation of that baby must be 100% unilaterally decided and executed by God.
Oh, man, I see the trap springing shut. We are right back to DUP, to divine unilateral predetermination.
Exactly.
The pagan determinism he spent 25 years fighting has just re-entered the building through the back door of infant baptism.
It is an unavoidable logical consequence. Under this new system, God's micromanaging Stoic-like providence either ensures that the parents successfully rush the baby to the bishop for baptism, or God's providence actively blocks them.
Like what?
Maybe the cart breaks down on the road, maybe the bishop is out of town, or maybe the baby suddenly dies in the night unbaptized.
And if they die unbaptized?
If the baby dies unbaptized, it means God intentionally, unilaterally damned that baby to eternal torment by withholding the opportunity for the sacrament.
But wait, the New Testament clearly ties salvation to faith.
Yeah.
Augustine couldn't rely on the baby's faith because a screaming newborn doesn't possess cognitive faith.
Right?
How did he legally justify a baptism, which is a sacrament of faith, for someone who can't believe?
He was forced to invent another novel concept, proxy faith.
Proxy faith.
Yeah. He argued that the parents, or the church sponsors holding the child, cognitively believe on behalf of the baby. He claimed the physical sacrament of water baptism itself magically acts as a substitute for the infant's personal faith.
Let me offer an analogy to capture the sheer destructive scale of what just happened.
Please do.
Imagine a massive, complex software system that runs perfectly, let's call it the early church free will OS.
I like it.
A minor bug is discovered in a specific regional application, the Pelagians questioning infant baptism. Augustine, acting as the lead developer, writes a quick patch update called Inherited Damnable Guilt to fix the local bug.
Right?
But when he deploys the patch, the code completely conflicts with the core architecture, and it accidentally crashes the entire global operating system.
Yes.
Augustine patched the infant baptism problem by inventing damnable birth guilt and proxy faith. But by doing that, he accidentally deleted the entire concept of human free choice from the Christian framework.
Because you can't have both.
Exactly. If salvation is entirely forced and unilateral for babies, basic logic demands it must be unilateral for adults too. You can't have a God who unilaterally determines the fate of infants but respects the free will of adults. The system demands uniformity.
That analogy perfectly captures the systemic collapse of his theology. Augustine took the Stoic concept of meticulous micromanaging providence, the idea that God strictly controls every leaf falling and every wagon wheel breaking, and he married it to the Manichaean concept of total human inability.
The idea that humans are born completely damned, dead, and incapable of choosing good.
Exactly. The collision of these two pagan concepts within a Christian framework happened in the year 412 CE. This is the exact historical moment that the T and the U of tulip Calvinism are officially born.
Total depravity and unconditional election.
Spot on.
But, as any developer knows, a rushed patch usually creates catastrophic new bugs.
Yeah, always.
If you forcefully baptize a baby, and according to Augustine, that baby genuinely receives the Holy Spirit and is legitimately saved, what happens when that baby grows up into a rebellious adult who completely abandons the faith and lives a terrible life? Did God's unilateral sovereign salvation fail?
And that would undermine his whole premise of God's absolute control. Well, Augustine recognized that massive bug in his new system almost immediately. To protect the logic, he had to invent yet another entirely novel doctrine to fix it.
What was it this time?
He invented the gift of perseverance.
Okay.
He theorized that while baptism truly saves you and gives you the Holy Spirit, God only gives a secondary, entirely secret grace of perseverance to a predetermined select few.
A secret grace.
Yeah. If you are baptized and saved, but you don't receive that hidden second gift, you will inevitably, unavoidably, fall away from the faith and be damned.
That is incredibly dark. So God saves you, adopts you, but secretly decides not to give you the staying power, guaranteeing you will eventually fail and end up in hell anyway?
Yeah.
And the secondary grace is entirely out of your control?
Completely.
That is the P in the TULIP acronym, perseverance of the saints.
Yep. So, stepping back to view the tragedy of this moment, Augustine has completely backed his brilliant mind into an inescapable theological corner. To defend a localized, non-universal church tradition of infant baptism against the annoying logic of the Pelagians, he has systematically abandoned the 300-year universal Christian consensus of relational, conditional grace.
And in its place,
He has resurrected the deterministic, non-relational, unilateral God of the Stoics and the Manichaeans and just slapped a Christian label on it.
But it's one thing to develop this bizarre reactionary theory in your study. It's another thing entirely to sell it to a church that has spent 3 centuries fighting these exact ideas.
Oh, absolutely.
Augustine couldn't just stand up in a council and say, hey, everyone, I use Stoic logic and Manichaean fatalism to solve our baptism problem. He needed biblical authority. He needed scriptural proof texts to justify this massive paradigm shift to his fellow bishops.
Which leads us directly to the great tragedy of his later career. To find scriptures that could be bent to support his newly adopted determinism, Augustine literally went back to the very texts his old Manichaean cult members used.
You're kidding.
No. He started deploying the exact same biblical interpretations that he himself had publicly mocked, dismantled, and defeated in debates decades earlier.
That is stunning. He basically dusted off the Manichaean playbook and presented it as Orthodox Christianity.
He absolutely did. The parallels are undeniable.
Give me an example.
Okay, for example, a prominent Manichaean leader named Fortunatus, whom Augustine debated in 392 CE, loved to quote Ephesians 2.89. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God.
A very famous verse.
Very. Fortunatus used this verse to argue that human beings do not have the free will to choose to believe, but rather God forcefully infuses faith into a completely dead soul.
And how did the young Augustine respond?
During their debate, the younger Augustine argued brilliantly against Fortunatus, pointing out that the text clearly allows for human free choice and that grace is God's loving response to our willing acceptance. But after the breaking point, in 412 CE, the older Augustine completely flips. He adopts Fortunatus's exact fatalistic interpretation. He begins arguing that humans are totally dead and faith is a unilateral, forced gift given only to the elect.
Did he do this with other core verses? What about like the famous declaration in John 14.6 where Jesus says, no one comes to the Father except through me?
The pattern holds perfectly. The Manichaeans constantly use John 14.6 to argue that God selectively chooses worthy souls and unilaterally drags them to salvation, bypassing their will entirely.
And early Augustine.
The early Augustine mocked this exegesis. He challenged them, writing, if I have lost my free choice by necessity, why do you blame me for my sins? He defended human agency.
Right.
But the later Augustine pivots and uses John 14.6 as his primary weapon to prove total human incapacity and irresistible grace.
Wow. And he also had to find biblical proof for his new concept of babies being born legally guilty. I know he redefines Psalm 51.5, right? Where King David passionately writes, in sin did my mother conceive me.
Yes, exactly. For centuries, Jewish rabbis and early Christian scholars universally understood David's words as poignant, poetic hyperbole.
Like an emotional exaggeration.
Right. It was an emotional expression of profound human weakness and sorrow, much like a modern person saying, I've been an absolute fool since the day I was born.
Sure.
No one took it as a literal statement of biological fact, but Augustine desperately needed scriptural proof that babies were born legally damned to justify his baptismal theory. So he aggressively stripped away the ancient poetic context and weaponized the verse.
He turned it into literal, forensic, medical evidence that the biological sexual act of conception physically transmits damnable guilt.
Exactly.
Man. But despite all of those reinterpretations, there is one piece of scripture that Dr. Wilson points to as the absolute linchpin of Augustine's entire new theology. And this is where the story goes from a theological debate to a historical tragedy.
It really does.
Because the linchpin is a simple translation error. Break down the tragic typo of Romans 5.12 for us.
This is undoubtedly one of the most consequential translation errors in all of human history. The Apostle Paul originally wrote the book of Romans in Greek.
Right.
In Romans chapter 5, verse 12, Paul is explaining how death entered the human experience through Adam. The original Greek text clearly states that death spread to all men, ho, all sinned.
Ho.
Yes. The Greek phrase ho translates plainly to because. Death spread to all men because all sinned.
Okay, so it implies personal action.
Exactly. This phrasing perfectly supported the unanimous early church view. Adam introduced physical mortality to the world, and because we are born mortal and weak, we all eventually use our free will to choose to sin, and therefore we die.
Because. That single word implies personal action, sequential causality, and individual moral responsibility.
Precisely the opposite of determinism.
Right.
However, Augustine, unlike many of his educated peers in the East, did not read Greek very well. He openly admitted he struggled with the language.
Oh.
Yeah. Therefore, he relied almost entirely on the Latin translation to the Bible, known as the Vulgate. And the anonymous translator who produced the Latin text Augustine used made a catastrophic grammatical error.
What did they do?
They mistranslated the Greek phrase ha into the Latin phrase in quo, which means in whom.
Oh, the implications of that are terrifying. So instead of the text saying, death spread because all sinned, the Bible Augustine was reading literally said, death spread to all men in whom, meaning inside of Adam, all sinned.
The theological butterfly effect of that mistake is just staggering. Do you see the monumental difference?
Oh, absolutely. If we all sinned in Adam, then we were all legally, mystically present in the Garden of Eden.
Exactly.
When Adam rebelled and ate the fruit, you and I and every newborn baby literally ate the fruit with him. We are all legally, forensically guilty of committing that exact ancient crime.
Yes. Because Augustine built his entire defense of infant damnation, and subsequently his doctrines of total inability and unconditional election entirely on the phrase in whom all sinned. He built the bedrock of his new theology on a prepositional typo.
Let me get this straight. You are telling me that a foundational pillar of modern Western theology, the widely accepted doctrine that every baby is born totally depraved and legally guilty of a crime committed thousands of years ago, which in turn necessitates unconditional predestination, is essentially the result of an ancient version of Google Translate failing in the 5th century.
The forensic linguistic evidence Dr. Wilson presents proves exactly that.
That is just wild.
And the downstream effects of this typo were utterly devastating to the Christian concept of God.
How so?
Because if humanity is simply a mass of perdition, born violently guilty, thoroughly corrupt, and biologically incapable of seeking God, it required a complete, top-to-bottom reinvention of God's character.
Because God could no longer be portrayed as a loving, grieving father standing at the door, earnestly inviting all people to a grand banquet.
Exactly. To make this system work logically, God had to become an exclusive, calculating deity who only loves the predetermined, arbitrarily selected elect, and who actively hates or coldly ignores the vast majority of humanity he created.
Which brings us to the most difficult verse for Augustine to explain away in his new system, 1 Timothy 2.4. The text plainly states, God desires all men to be saved.
Yeah, that's a tough one for a determinist.
Right. If God genuinely desires all men to be saved, and Augustine's newly constructed God is a stoic micromanager who always gets exactly what he wants without exception, then universal salvation should logically happen. Everyone should be saved.
But obviously they aren't.
Exactly. So how did Augustine handle the glaring contradiction of 1 Timothy 2.4?
Watching Augustine wrestle with 1 Timothy 2.4 over the last decades of his life is honestly like watching a brilliant defense attorney try to escape from a locked room of his own design.
I can imagine.
Over the course of 20 years, he attempted 5 different, increasingly tortured linguistic explanations to neutralize the verse. 5. First, he claimed all men just meant God provides a general opportunity for all. But when he realized that violated his own new doctrine of total inability, he shifted tactics.
Okay, what was his next move?
He argued that all really means all classes of men, meaning God desires to save some rich people, some poor people, some kings, and some peasants.
Wait, he argued that God desires diverse demographic categories of people to be saved, not every individual human being?
Yep.
That is a massive linguistic stretch.
It is absolute linguistic gymnastics. Finally, near the end of his life, fully entrenched in determinism, he twisted the text completely backward. He decreed that 1 Timothy 2.4 actually means all who are saved because God desires it.
Oh, wow. So he redefined the universal word all to exclusively mean the elect.
He took a verse celebrating the boundless universal love of the Christian God and reduced it to a narrow tautological statement about an arbitrary selection process.
That's tragic.
Prominent Catholic scholars like Edmund Hill have pointed out how incredibly weak and defensive this makes Augustine's entire later system. He literally had to change the plain, universally understood meaning of Scripture to protect the fragile logical deductions he made during the Pelagian crisis.
So we essentially have a perfect historical storm. We have localized North African church traditions violently colliding with a refugee crisis. We have a brilliant, highly stressed bishop panicking and resorting to Stoic logic to win an argument. We have Gnostic and Manichaean interpretations resurrected from his cult days. And we have a catastrophic Latin typo fundamentally altering the words of the Apostle Paul.
That's the recipe.
But the question that haunts this entire investigation is, how does this bizarre, reactionary, localized theology survive? How does it bypass the rest of the church and become the unquestioned bedrock of the Protestant Reformation 1,000 years later?
To understand what we can call the Reformation ripple, we need to look at the specific factors that allowed Augustine to pull off this theological heist without being immediately excommunicated. Wilson identifies 10 crucial factors that made Augustine uniquely capable of enforcing this shift. We will focus on the most impactful ones. First and foremost, we must remember Augustine's professional background.
Right.
He was not trained as a Greek biblical scholar. He was trained as a master rhetorician. He was essentially a high-powered defense attorney and a politician.
So he knew how to talk.
He was a master of the art of persuasion. He knew exactly how to win an argument, how to manipulate emotions, and how to outmaneuver opponents, even when his underlying logic was deeply flawed. He possessed the unique genius to use comforting, traditional Christian vocabulary while quietly redefining the words with Stoic or Neoplatonic meanings.
He was the ultimate salesman. He could sell absolute pagan determinism to a freedom-loving Christian church by dressing it up in beautiful, poetic, biblical language.
He was devastatingly effective at it. The second major factor was his political power. Early in his career, he secured an illegal appointment as a co-bishop in Hippo.
An illegal appointment.
Yeah, and this unorthodox power grab eventually gave him massive, relatively unchecked authority in the North African church, allowing him to silence dissenters and enforce his views regionally.
Wow.
But the third factor is perhaps the most psychologically revealing: his severe, lifelong preoccupation with sexual sin.
Right, from his confessions.
Exactly. We have to remember the intimate details of his famous confessions. He spent over a decade living with concubines before finally taking a vow of strict celibacy. He viewed his own sexual desires as a dark, overpowering, demonic force that completely bypassed his rationality.
So it's very personal.
Deeply personal. And this deeply personal, dramatic struggle mapped perfectly onto his new doctrine. Because he felt he couldn't control his own lust, he theorized that no one can control their will. He projected his own intense personal trauma and loss of control onto the entire human race, concluding that sexual procreation itself is the mechanism that physically transmits the disease and guilt of sin.
He used his own psychological baggage to define the baseline of human nature. He couldn't choose to be good, so he decided humanity fundamentally lacks the capacity to choose good.
It's exactly what happened.
And through the sheer, overwhelming force of his intellect, his rhetorical brilliance, and his voluminous writings, he successfully installed this new operating system. He single-handedly invented the foundational concepts that would later become the 5 points of Calvinism: total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, which is the horrifying idea that Christ only died for the predestined elect, not the whole world irresistible grace, and the perseverance of the saints.
The TULIP.
The tulip P.
He built the skyscraper on sand, and because he was so eloquent, no one checked the basement. Augustine dies in 430 CE as the Vandals are literally burning his city.
Wow.
Now, we fast forward 1100 years. We arrive in the turbulent 16th century. The medieval Catholic Church is struggling with massive systemic corruption, selling indulgences to buy souls out of purgatory, engaging in blatant political power grabs.
Right, the dark ages of the church.
Oh, exactly. A passionate monk in Germany named Martin Luther reads his Bible, looks at the corruption, and says, "Enough. We are saved by grace, not by buying merit." He triggers the monumental Protestant Reformation.
But Martin Luther wasn't just a random monk.
No, he was an Augustinian monk.
Exactly. He belonged to an order specifically dedicated to studying and revering the writings of Augustine.
Yes. And a generation after Luther, the brilliant French theologian John Calvin writes his magnum opus, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, which becomes the undisputed foundational textbook for all Reformed theology. Do you know how many times John Calvin explicitly quotes Augustine in that book?
How many?
Over 400 times. Calvin was so dependent on him that he literally admitted in writing, "Augustine is so wholly within me that I could write my entire theology out of his writings."
This is literally the most catastrophic game of historical telephone ever played.
It really is.
Luther and Calvin are desperately trying to bypass the medieval popes and get back to the pure, original Christianity of the apostles. They look back through history and they see this towering, articulate genius, Augustine. They simply assume that Augustine is accurately summarizing the unified doctrine of all the early church fathers who came before him.
And that assumption was their fatal historical error. Luther and Calvin were brilliant men, but they were severely handicapped by the limited resources of their time.
Right.
They were completely unaware of the 300-year unanimous consensus on free choice that preceded Augustine. They didn't have access to the meticulous forensic timelines and manuscript analyses that scholars like Dr. Wilson have today.
They couldn't have known about the retcons.
Exactly. They didn't realize that Augustine had radically changed his mind in 412 CE due to a local crisis, or that he had retroactively edited his own books to cover his tracks.
So Calvin thought he was picking up the phone and calling the Apostle Paul, but the call was secretly routed through a 5th century switchboard operator who was actively patching in Stoic philosophers, Manichaean cult leaders, and mistranslated Latin texts.
That is the ultimate heartbreaking tragedy of this historical misunderstanding. The Protestant reformers were acting heroically. They were trying to rescue the church from the merit-based, works-righteousness corruption of medieval Catholicism. They desperately wanted to cling to the beauty of unmerited grace.
But by relying entirely on the later retconned writings of Augustine.
They didn't inherit the unmerited relational grace of the early Christians. They inherited the radicalized, unilateral, forced grace of the Manichaean God. They inherited a rigid, deterministic system where God intentionally creates the vast majority of human beings for the express purpose of damning them to eternal fire, simply to demonstrate the glory of his sovereign power. Man! And because intellectual giants like Luther and Calvin championed this system, theology became the defining, unshakable characteristic of Reformed Protestantism. It is taught in highly respected seminaries all over the world today as the deepest, purest, most intellectually rigorous reading of the Bible.
When, in stark reality, as Dr. Wilson's exhaustive thesis demonstrates beyond a reasonable doubt, Augustinian Calvinism is a towering skyscraper built on an incredibly unstable foundation of pagan syncretism.
Right.
It's an elaborate theological house of cards built on the back of a mistranslated Latin preposition, a panic defense of infant baptism, and the lingering psychological trauma of a former cult member.
Let's summarize the immense journey we've taken today through the basement of Western theology.
Let's do it.
We started by tracing the philosophically polluted waters of antiquity, examining the Stoic dog dragged by the cart, the Neoplatonic dead wills requiring a divine injection, the Manichaean baby damned at birth by the crime of physical matter.
We saw how the magnificent early Christian church, for 300 glorious, unbroken years, stood as a unified, impenetrable wall against that oppressive determinism, fiercely defending a God of relational love and genuine human free choice.
Yes.
We investigated the shocking forensic evidence proving that Augustine actually agreed with them and defended free will for 25 years, until the terror of the Pelagian crisis and the fall of Rome pushed his brilliant mind into an inescapable logical trap.
The trap of infant baptism.
Exactly. To defend his local tradition of baptizing guiltless babies, he invented the horrifying concept of inherited damnable guilt, totally erased human free will from the equation, and resurrected the very pagan determinism he used to fight. And finally, we watched how that 5th century local panic got permanently hardwired into the Protestant Reformation by well-meaning monks like Luther and Calvin.
It is a remarkable and honestly sobering historical narrative. But the value of Dr. Wilson's work isn't just in deconstruction.
He doesn't just tear it down.
No. He doesn't just tear down the two-look skyscraper and leave us in the rubble. He offers a constructive, historically accurate alternative. He proposes a new acronym that actually reflects the true, unanimous consensus of the early church before the Augustine pivot.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
He calls it the Grace Framework, GRACE.
An acronym to replace an acronym. I love it. Break down the grace framework for us.
The G stands for God offers salvation equally to all. There is no secret, pre-selected elite.
Nice.
The R stands for residual free choice, acknowledging that while humans are deeply broken and fallen, we retain the innate, God-given capacity to respond to love.
Right.
The A stands for atonement universally, the belief that Christ died for the sins of the whole world, not just a limited few. The C stands for conditional election, the early church view that God elects humanity based on his perfect foreknowledge of our relational faith. And finally, the E stands for eternal life for all who freely believe.
That's beautiful.
It is. The Grace Framework rescues theology from determinism. It returns us to a worldview where the biblical statement, God is love, is the absolute primary foundational truth, coming long before the Stoic philosophical idea that God is a micromanaging sovereign.
It fundamentally restores the relationship between creator and creation. It takes away the cold, calculating puppet master in the sky and gives us back a grieving, loving father waiting on the porch for the prodigal son to come home.
Exactly.
We started this deep dive talking about skyscrapers and foundations. We walk past them every day, and we assume the bedrock is solid just because the building has managed to stand for a long time. We trust the engineers of history.
We do.
But Dr. Wilson has handed us the original blueprints, handed us a flashlight, and shown us the massive, terrifying cracks in the basement.
Which leaves us with one final, deeply provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over long after this conversation ends.
Okay, lay it on us.
If the most famous, structurally dominant theological framework in the Western world, a robust intellectual system that defines the very character of God for millions of devout people today, was originally duct-taped together simply to justify the emergency baptism of infants.
Right.
A practice that, ironically, many of those very same modern Calvinist denominations no longer even believe in or practice. What other unquestioned, seemingly rock-solid traditions in our modern lives are actually built entirely on the forgotten, localized panics of ancient history?
Wow. That is a question worth losing some sleep over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the foundations of our faith and history. We encourage you to keep questioning the architecture around you, keep digging fearlessly into the basement of your own inherited beliefs, and always, always let the pursuit of truth triumph over the comfort of tradition.